Coming up on today's video, I'm going to be using Capture One 12 to do some landscape and travel photo edits from a recent road trip. Now, I am using Capture One 12, but a lot of the tips and techniques I'm going to be using should be applicable in Lightroom as well. Let's make a start by having a look at the photos that we're going to be editing, and then we'll dive straight into Capture One. So here we are in Capture One, and this is the first of the 4 shots that I'm going to be taking you through the edit. Now this is a shot that I took in the town of Revenge in Croatia, and it's one I'm pretty pleased with. You can see I got down low using these rocks as foreground, used a slow shutter speed of I think about 20 seconds, in fact exactly 20 seconds it says here, to get this nice motion blur of the water. But there's a lot that I want to do to make this shot even better. So we'll start at the top in my edit panel up here with the white balance. Now at the moment I don't think it's too bad, but there are a few tweaks that I want to make. Now I do want to warm it up ever so slightly, maybe just to this sort of thing. I think looks good. And I'm going to take the tint down a little bit, because at the moment you can see it's a little bit too purple. If we keep going further that way, it gets very, very purple. Don't really want that. I want to bring that down a little bit, bring some more of those blue tones back. I think something around there. It's already starting to look quite a bit nicer. I'll close my layers tab. Next thing we'll move on to is exposure. Now overall I think this is exposed pretty well. There's not a whole lot I want to do to this, but one thing that I think I do want is to bring the contrast down, because there is a lot of very strong highlights in the scene and very dark shadows, and if you take that contrast too far up then that just gets ridiculous. I actually want to bring it down by not a lot, probably just -10. I think that looks pretty good. And maybe just bring the brightness up just a small amount, just to +5. And if we just have a quick look at the before and after, already I'm starting to like how this shot is coming up. We'll close that. So I'll now move into the high dynamic range panel, because that is when I can really take control of these highlights and shadows. So definitely there is a strong highlight in the sky, so I am going to be trying to bring that under control. Not too much. If I go too far, then we start to lose a lot of contrast up in that sky, and it looks very, very flat, and it looks a bit terrible generally. So I'm going to be a bit subtle and go to maybe somewhere around, the mid-30s, somewhere around there. And I am going to also boost the shadows, but not by too much, because I don't really want it to boost the whole scene. I'm going to do some more tweaks a little later to bring out some more of a detail in the rocks. So I'm going to leave it like that. And I'm going to move on then to color balance. Now this is when you can add tones to the shadows, the midtones and the highlights independently, and that's when you can get a really, really nice cinematic color graded look. So the first thing I want to do is bring in some blue to cyan tones in those shadows. I don't want to go overboard on this. I think maybe just that amount, and you can have fine control by using these little tabs here. So I want to keep that more in the cyan, but I want to bring it down a little bit. That's a bit too much at the moment. I think it looks good. And I want to put in a bit more warmth into those highlights. So I'm going to bring this into the orange tones. If you can see, if you go too far, then it just looks daft. So I want to keep it at a reasonably low to mid level. I think that looks quite nice. But one of the interesting things that I do like to do when I'm working in Capture One is take a look at some of the styles and presets that you can get, some of the ones that Capture One themselves do. You can see here there's lots of different style packs that you can get from Capture One. But for this one, I know that having had a play around with some of the ones before, I want to use some of the Latitude Sunbound ones. Now, these are the ones that they've made to really give like a very bright, summery look to their shots. If we just hover over these, you can see some of these effects, and these are very, very bright and overboard. The ones that I really like for this shot is the Calabria. set, because I really like the toning that this does. But again, as we can see, even the standard mid Calabria is very, very bright, as is Calabria brackets bright. So it's Calabria brackets dark that I want to use. So I'm going to apply this, but crucially, I'm going to right click and I'm going to go apply to new layer. Now, the reason I've done that is because while I like a lot of the color toning that this has brought in, I don't like how much of it is actually there. It's far too much. But by applying it to a new layer on top of the background, I can actually bring down the opacity. So I can bring it down all the way to 0 so it doesn't apply. And then I can just start to slowly dial in the amount that I actually really want. Now you're starting to see the effects more and more at this point, and I think actually around 50%, half opacity, I think is a really nice amount that you get a beautiful look to the shot, but it doesn't look just horrible. And if we just flick that layer on and off, we can see the difference that that's making. Turn it off, there we go, back on. It's particularly noticeable, I think, in the rocks. Looks really, really nice. So I'm pretty pleased with that. Other thing I want to do is add another new layer, and using the linear gradient mask tool, I just want to bring down some of the highlights in that sky. So I'm going to bring the gradient tool to about there. I'm going to go into exposure and I'm going to bring that down ever so slightly to maybe -22. And I'm also going to use the high dynamic range tool again and just try and bring down those highlights just a little bit. Again, this is only applying, if we press M, we can see the mask. So that's only where it's applying, where it's red. So that's only going to be affecting the sky, which is exactly what I want. And again, if we turn that on and off, we can see that it just helps bring those under control. In fact, that's actually a little bit too much. So I'm going to bring the opacity on that down as well. Probably just to about half again, roughly. Okay, next up, I said I wanted to take care of some of the dark shadows on these rocks, and that's what I'm going to do now. So on another new layer, and I'm going to get the mask tool, the draw mask tool this time, and I'm going to press M because I want to make sure I can see this mask, and I'm going to start painting in the mask on the very, very dark parts around these rocks. Painting in here, around these very, very dark areas, that just the areas where it's really clipping into black, and I just want a bit more detail in those rocks. They'll be here, and these ones right down in the foreground. Okay, that's probably enough. Maybe a little bit here, and probably across there. So that's where I want this effect to be roughly applying. But at the moment, that mask is a little bit much in places. As you can see, it goes over into the water. So there's a couple of things I'm going to do. First of all, up here, I'm going to click Luma Range. Now what that does is allow you to selectively apply the mask to only bright or dark parts of the scene. So in this case, I know that I really only want it on the dark parts of the rock. So I can bring this right down, keep on going. And as I do, particularly here at that point, if you have a look at the rock in the middle of the scene, you can see that where it's gone over onto the sea, as I bring this up and down, it's refining that mask into only applying on the very, very dark parts of the rocks. That looks about right. I'm going to press apply. But other thing I can do is I can go to feather mask, and we can just bring up that feather. And if we go right to the top, this is being very slow because I am capturing my screen at the moment. You can see that it softens the edges a lot of where that mask is applied, which just helps make it blend a little more naturally into the scene. You don't have any hard edges where you've evidently made some changes. So I'm going to keep that right at the top, right at 100. I'm going to click apply. So now that my mask is in place, I'm going to press M so that we can't see it. I'm going to go back into my exposure tool, bring up that exposure just a touch, and again in the high dynamic range tool, I'm going to bring up those shadows just a little bit. And I think that's enough. I don't want to go overboard. If you take the shadow right up to its top, then again, you know, those rocks start looking absolutely bonkers. We do not want that at all. It's all about subtlety with these changes. So yeah, I think about 10, maybe a little bit up, about 15. I think that looks pretty good. And then again, if we turn that layer off, then we can see just how much difference that's making. These rock, particularly around here where it's falling almost into complete blackness, is suddenly there's more detail to be seen. The last layer that I want to apply though is another linear graduation, but this time I want to apply it to the bottom left hand of this scene, because around here there's a lot of brightness, and that I think is distracting away from where I really want the eye to be drawn, which is of course more this middle section. Obviously we've got the tower in the distance, so I'm going to bring in this mask. Again, I'll press M so we can see where it's falling. That didn't work. Maybe I need to do this. There we go. So that is where that mask is falling now, and I'm going to bring the exposure down, just darkening that corner, making it a little less distracting. About that, I think works really nicely. And as a result of that, we don't have these very bright highlights drawing the eye. Instead, your eye falls much more towards the interesting rocks in the middle, to where the water's lapping around the edge, and then of course then to the building in the distance, which I think looks really, really nice. So those are the main edits that I want to do. The last thing, of course, is to rotate and to do a crop, and arguably that's something I could have done first, but I didn't. Now, Capture One makes it pretty easy to get a nice straight horizon. If you click the straighten tool, you can literally click and draw a line of where you want it to go, and it will do the rest. Actually, looks like it was already pretty straight to begin with. That's good. So then I can go to my crop tool and I can pick an aspect ratio, and for this it's going to be 3:4 because I like a 3:4 crop. And I'm going to bring that in a little bit, and this is just sort of taking away some of the let's say less relevant parts of the left hand of the scene. And of course, if I move it in, then I can stop this back end of a yacht being in my image. And this is good as well because I can make the image fit the rule of thirds a little bit more. If you see where the right hand thirds is going to be applying when that grid comes up, it's lying right in where this gap in the rocks forms, and it's pretty much over the building as well. So I think this works really nicely. And I can move it up slightly as well. And then we click back onto this. And there is our finished image. I'm really pleased with this. I think it looks good. Definitely got that really nice summery vibe to it. And I think if we have a quick look at the before and the after, we can see just how much difference that has made. So here's the next image that we're going to take a look at. This is a nice church I found in Croatia, and I was really keen on the framing with these, with the trees and with the buildings, and probably more of a travel photo than it is, strictly speaking, a landscape, but hell, I think it qualifies, so let's keep it in. So again, first off, let's start with our white balance. I do want to warm this up a little bit because it is looking a little bit cold. And again, I think my tint is a little bit on the magenta side, so I'm going to bring that down just a bit to about there, which I think has a nicer look to it. Now, evidently with this scene, there's a big difference between the bright highlight of the sky and then the darkness of the trees. So I'm going to go straight to the high dynamic range panel down here, and I suspect already with this shot that I'm going to be heavily relying on this tool. Now, I don't want to go nuts with it, but I do know that I need to really bring those highlights under control quite a lot. Probably not all the way to 100. I think that's a little bit much, but I think maybe somewhere around 80 is already starting to look a lot better. And again, the shadows, we really need to bring those up quite a lot. But again, I don't want to go to 100 with that, because then that's what happens, and no. Just absolutely not. So I think somewhere maybe around, I'd say around 40 or so. That looks pretty nice actually. And we can probably tweak that a little bit later on. I do maybe bring my exposure down just a touch, ever so slightly. That's negligible amount, hasn't really done anything, but there we go. Now I do think as well I want to add a little bit of clarity just to help this pop, but only a small amount, I think 5 or 6, something like that. Because again, you take that to 100 and things start to go odd. But I do want to give it that little bit of crispness, a little bit of punch. So maybe actually around 10, I think, is a nice amount that we can do. Further down into color balance, and again, I think bringing in a little bit of blues into those shadows is going to be nice for this scene. And again, warming up those highlights, but not quite that much. In fact, let's bring that around to the orange and bring the actual intensity, the saturation of that highlight toning down. It's really handy having these tools here. Now you can do these individually and you get a little bit more granular control of what you're doing, but I quite like seeing the 3 wheels there. Now I tend not to touch the midtone all that much. If you move that around, then it just sort of applies too much color to the whole scene, and I quite like just if we just double click that to reset it, I quite like just being able to use the shadow and the highlight independently to do a bit of processing there. So one of the things I have noticed is putting me off this picture a little bit at the moment is that it is, for one, ever so slightly tilted. This this church tower really should be the thing which is completely straight in the scene. So I'm going to draw a line straight down its middle, and then as you see, Capture One straightens that building up. So that is now completely upright. But then this here is a very dominant vertical line, and it isn't sitting flush with the edge of the picture, which is just making it look a little bit wonky to my eye. So I'm going to use the key stoning tool. And what this does is allow you to put vertical lines in place against a vertical object or a vertical line or whatever you want to basically tell the program this should be going straight up. And then again, I can put this one up against, say, this little aerial, a thing, which again is much more in line with the church. And if I then click apply, okay, cut to me having had a bit of a play around with the keystoning tool, and I've actually found that putting both the keystoning guides, I suppose, against both the edge of this building and this drain pipe, because they are very, very dominant vertical lines, and then hitting apply is allowing Capture One to make sure that these lines are both completely vertical and sit flush with the edge of the picture. But of course, it still kept the church in line. And overall, I just think that is a much neater looking shot. Maybe it's the sort of thing that people may not really care about or ever notice, but I just think it brings the scene together a little bit more. So one of the last things that I want to do on this is I want to add a gradient to the edge of this image, because these trees are incredibly dark. They've really fallen into shadow, and I want to bring those out a little bit more. So by going to layers, and again, I've got the gradient tool selected, I can bring in, like so, bring in that gradient mask up to about here. And if we press M, we can see where that's applying. And for the most part, it's on the trees. It's also going to be applying to this building and into the sky a little bit. So I'm going to press Loom Arrange and tell it that I only want the mask to be applied to the very dark parts of the scene, which is the shadowy parts of the tree. You can see, having done that, it's taken it away from all the bits of the sky where I don't want this mask to be applying. If I take it down further, then we'll probably be able to take it away from the building. Yep, we can see that the building underneath is starting to peek through the mask. So let's do that. Let's click apply. That's great. Press M to stop showing the mask, although it's left an error. There we go, it's popped back. And then we can go to exposure and just bring that up just a little bit. I don't want to bring it up too much because, again, I don't want to have that overly HDR look, but I just want to bring out the detail in those leaves a little bit. Helps keep it a nice summery vibe overall. Yeah, which I think looks pretty good. I think that just makes a huge difference to the sea when you turn that on and off. One side it's fallen very much into shadow, and now suddenly, there we go, there's light falling on those trees, those greens are really popping out. I think that looks pretty cool. But that isn't the final thing I want to do. Now, I do have a bit of a style in mind for this, and it's one of the matte ones which Capture One had produced. What I do like is the creative options you've got in just glancing your cursor over the different looks. None of them are applying, but you can just get a little bit of extra creative juice from these by seeing a style that maybe you didn't consider for your image, and just get some ideas of how you may want to go about editing things. Now, the one I particularly like for this scene is number 2, is this one right here. I think it gives a nice sort of filmic look, a little bit of fade to those shadows, which I think looks great. But as before, I don't want to apply the whole thing, so I'm going to put it onto a new layer. And then we'll see it up here, MTO2, and I'm going to bring that opacity right down. I'm going to start from 0. I'm going to slowly build up that look. Okay, getting there. Okay, yeah, I think maybe about 40 actually looks pretty good. It's very easy just to buy packs of presets from your favorite Instagrammer or whoever selling them and just apply them to their scene and trying to get the look that they do. But really, I think the best way to use any kind of presets is to apply them subtly and maybe even layer them up on top of each other. And this is great because this way it's just giving a subtle extra look to this scene. But it's not going overboard and completely changing all of the edits that I've done. It's just adding in that extra little touch, which I think looks pretty cool. So I'd say that's it for this image. I'm really pleased with this. And again, let's just see what it looks like with all the edits off. And there we go. Very dark shadows in those trees. And, you know, I think quite a nice composition, but the actual exposure doesn't really do anything for me. And then here is what we've done. I think this is a really, really nice travel scene. It certainly captures, I think, a lot of the mood that I had when I was there. There's probably a few other tweaks I could do this. In fact, maybe lastly, just having a look at this sky, it's now gone a little bit washed out, and there is a good way that I like to do of changing that. Let's go back to the background layer, and I'm going right down to the bottom to color editor, and I'm going to click the picker. I'm going to just click on that sky, and as you can see now, it's showing me that only this sky has been selected, and you can change this. You can bring it out so it's selecting more of those colors. But this is going to mean that I'm only applying these edits now to this one color. In fact, if you click View Selected Color Range, you can see that only that blue is showing through. Turn that off. And I'm just going to increase the saturation on that blue a little bit. I'm also going to bring the lightness down, which is just going to help add a little bit more contrast in that sky. Separates the blue from the clouds. I could play with the hue maybe and bring it down because there's a little bit too much magenta in that sky at the moment. So if I bring it further down so that maybe you don't want to go too far, otherwise it goes green and murky, but too far the other way it's very, very purple. So I think maybe somewhere around -7 actually looks quite good. Okay, so now I'm finished with my shot. Of course, I'll probably end up going back and doing some more tweaks anyway, but let's have another look. That was before, and there we go afterwards with the finished shot. I'm really pleased with how this one comes out. So let's move on to the next one. Brings us then on to this flower shot, or just a daisy, I suppose it really is. Which is just the shot I found at the side of a road when I was driving through the Dolomites last year, and this flower just particularly stood out to me. It is taller than the grass around it, and the white, vibrant petals really just stood out against everything else, with the mountains in the background. It's a very, very simple scene, probably not the most inspired photo ever, but it did something for me, but I think I can make it a lot better with some tweaks. So as before, let's start with the white balance. Now, I feel that this is already far too warm, so I want to cool this down quite a way, actually. I may even go that far. Something around 5, 8, 8, 6-ish. And I'll leave the tint as it is, because I think that's actually got a nice balance at the moment. Now I'm going to go into the HDR panel first, because there's a lot of highlights which I really want to kind of bring under control. So I'm going to bring this highlight slider to about 41. I might just raise the shadows a little bit less, actually. Actually, I'm going to leave the shadows where they are. I like that it's a little bit darker. It's what helps the flower pop out from the scene a little bit more. But what will help that is adding a little bit of clarity, just a touch. Again, don't want to go overboard with clarity because it starts to get weird and don't like that at all. So I'm going to keep that very much... I've gone the wrong way. I just realised what I was doing there. Yeah, of course, it needs to be in the middle. I'm going to keep that somewhere 7. I think 7 looks good. That's pretty good to me. I actually am going to go back into the exposure, and I'm going to just bring the exposure down overall a little bit. I think about there. Looks pretty good. Okay. So I'm going to go down into the color balance, and we're going to just play with the shadows at first, because I do want to bring in a little bit of blue again into those shadows, but not too much. As you can see, it's only a very, very small amount. And I can bring some orange into those highlights. I think even less. Something around there looks good. And you can have a look at how these different things are affecting the scene. If I turn that off, take a look at how the greens change when we make that. So it just brings a little bit more sort of depth and a little blue hue into those, which I just think makes them look a little bit more vibrant. But I can extend that further down in the bottom using the color editor. Now, if I just go into the basic tab and we just select the greens there, and then I can take the hue slider, and if I bring it all the way to the left, you'll see it goes very yellow and orange. Now, often I do edits that use this, but for this shot, I actually really want to bring in a lot of like vibrancy and rich greens into these leaves. So I'm actually going to go the other way, and I'm going to add in, again, if you go too far, then it starts going very sort of turquoisey, and I don't want that at all. So I'm going to bring that just to maybe around the 2.5 mark. I think that adds in a nice amount. I could even brighten those up, or even darken them down. No, I think brighten them a touch, just a little bit. And again, if we turn that on and off, it's very subtle, but I do like it. I think it adds something. Okay, but there's more that I think I can do to this, and I think I'm going to do some of the most dramatic edits using different layers. And the first thing I want to do is I do just want to put a graduated linear filter on the sky, because it is overpoweringly bright. So my hope is that by putting that in, and I can bring that exposure down, and that just brings that sky under control a little bit more, which I like. I think that's good. But the other thing that I really want to do is on a new layer, and using the radial gradient mask, is I want to, and if we bring that up and press M, so I can see that mask like that. There we go. Now we can see that that is applying a mask to everywhere except for the flower, which is exactly what I want. Now, if I drag this inner circle, that is how I can feather the mask. So as you can see, around here where it's very dark red, that's where it's applying the mask at 100%, and then it feathers off gradually towards the middle. If I pull this back out, you can see there's a very hard edge between where the mask is applying and where it isn't, and that would be bonkers. So I'll pull that right in, and I really want to keep that nice and soft, very nice and feathered. I don't want to be too obvious that that mask is in place. But the point of putting that in there is that I can bring that exposure down just steadily. It's darkening all the scene except for that flower. Now what that does is really draw the eye to that flower in the middle. It really makes it look like it's caught this shaft of light and it's standing out from the scene, which I just think helps pull everything together really, really nicely. Okay, but I do want to do some cropping to this. It's already set to a 3x4 crop, which I think is what I want on this scene. Let's give it a try. I think because I did quite like having a lot more space up and on the bottom, but I want to make sure that I'm cropping out this extra flower on the left hand side. That's sort of drawing the eye a little bit. I think something kind of like that might work. Let's just have a little look at that by itself. So you know what? I don't like that as much. I don't like the aspect ratio. So I tried it again with a 5x7 crop, and I think this looks a lot better. Cropping in too close on the flower in this image loses all the context around it. The whole point of this image is that this flower is the one that's sort of standing out proud by itself when nothing else is really catching the eye. So by keeping a wide scene, you really get a better sense of how that flower is positioned in amongst all this green. Now the absolute last thing that I want to do on here though is to create a heel layer. And the brush that is going to give me eventually when I do this, draw mask, there we go. Let's use that sort of size, and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, because what I want to do is I find these grass stems here going over the mountain over the top very, very distracting. So I want to try and use the let's small that brush down a little bit. There we go. Try and use the healing layers in Capture One just to try and paint over those, and hopefully they can just pop out. We can pretend they were never there. Okay, I mean that's not too bad. If we click this on and off, I think that's done a pretty good job. This is certainly something that I would want to neaten up in Photoshop. There are some other stems that I think aren't necessarily as distracting, but maybe there's bits and bobs I could do there. But certainly I think that it is a very good job in getting that. And if I look at the whole picture by itself, I'm no longer distracted by those things there. So that's pretty good. I may also just have a little go at this bit of petal that's sort of hanging off the edge of the frame. I think that is slightly distracting. So if I do that, why is it doing that? I don't know. Let's undo that change. And I'm going to do this on a new layer. In fact, maybe I'll do a new clone layer, and then I can just do that. And then I can move this up here. That hasn't really worked either. Okay. What about over there? That's better. That's pretty much fine. If we have a look before and after, it just looks like there's a little random bit of grass in there. So that is okay by me. Now I've had another look at the image full screen after doing some of the cleanup down here. I actually don't think this is very good at all around here. So I'm going to just take off that repair layer there. And I'm going to do just some work in Photoshop because I think I can do a much neater job, and I don't want to be showing off anything that's too unfinished. So for now I am going to be leaving those stems in, but I'll go and clean those up in a little bit. But I am just going to have another little bit of a tweak of this white balance, selecting the background layer, because I feel I can get those colors a little bit closer to what I want. I think if I cool it down a little bit further, it's a bit too much. Something about maybe 5.2, something like that. I think that looks nice. Just going to play with the tint, take it from one side to the other. Actually, I think somewhere bang in the middle, actually. Like that, as it was. I think that's looking a lot better. So I think that brings me to an end on this image. If we just have a quick look at the before and after, we can see that it was very, very warm at first, and I don't think the flower stood out in quite the way I wanted it to, but with these edits, I think this has turned this into a much nicer looking shot. So time to move on to the next one. And so that brings us on to our last image, which is this one here of this church in the Dolomites. And immediately I know that I want to do a few things to this to really emphasize the sunset that's going on. And first of all, that means going into our white balance and warming it up by quite a bit. I want to take it probably up to maybe around that point. I think looks quite good. Really boosted those warm tones. The tint I think I'm going to leave as is. I don't think I really want to touch that. There is some more color toning that I'm going to do later on, but I'm going to be using the color balance tool rather than white balance. First, in exposure, I just want to bring the contrast down, I feel. I want to give it much more of that dreamy look, and if you boost the contrast too much, everything starts getting a little bit punchy, and I want to avoid that. So I'm going to bring it down, not by a lot, I think just by about -10 or so. I think it looks pretty good. Maybe up the brightness. No, maybe not. Let's actually bring the brightness down just a few little dots. -6, I think looks pretty good. In the HDR, I do definitely want to bring those highlights down a touch. Actually, you know what? Obviously, the sky here is a real problem. It's lost a lot of information, and so instead we've just got this big strip of white, which really draws the eye. There's nothing that I can really do to recover those highlights, because as you can see, all this information has been lost, and it's affecting the mountains here where it's sort of flaring over the top, and I don't like that at all. So I'm going to leave the highlights. I'm going to bring them a little bit just to kind of rescue some of this mountain stuff here. The shadows, though, I think I'm going to leave those pretty much as they are. I might just add two little bits. Makes very little difference really, but I hope by the end it'll all come together. Now the clarity, I want to reduce the clarity like I did with the contrast, because again, if you take that right up, then it gets very crunchy and everything sort of pops out and you lose that sort of dreamy feel. So I'm going to bring that down, I think, to about -10. Now, this probably isn't really doing a whole lot to the scene, but I just overall like this very soft feel to the image, which is pretty much how I remember it being, so that's quite nice. Now, in the color balance, I definitely want to add some orange into those highlights to really emphasize the warmth of the sunset. But in the shadows, rather than adding blue or cyan, which is going to cool it down, I actually want to emphasize the sunset even more by adding in some purple into those shadows. And as you can see, as I push this up, it brings this real richness into this sunset scene. If you go too far, then obviously it looks a bit ridiculous. So I want to be subtle with this and bring it up maybe to about there. I think looks really good. It's given a lovely tone overall to this image. There are a few things extra that I think I can do to this scene. Now, one of them is that I think that I can get a lot more by using one of the styles. Now, as I've said before, there are loads of different styles to choose from, and it's great just to be able to mouse over them and see what different effects that they want. Now, the one I believe that I want for this is in the seasonal pack, seasonal number 5. I love what it does to bring out these golden tones, and there is a crispness that is there, but it's being sort of controlled by me reducing the contrast before. But as before, I don't want to add the maximum amount of this filter, so I'm going to apply it to a new layer, go up into my layers where I can see that's it right there, and I'm going to bring that opacity right down to 0 so we can see exactly what it was like without it. And now we can just start to dial it back in bit by bit up until I get to a point where I think I want it. And as I do, you can just see how much it's bringing in, particularly around here on this side of the hill. It's really bringing in these lovely golden tones and adding some sort of extra definition between the highlights and the shadows, which I really like. But I think about 40% is exactly where I want it to be. If we turn that on and off, it's not a massive change, but it really does just give that extra feel of a golden sunset, and I really like that. But then I want to add a new layer, and I want to hit G for my gradient tool, and I want to bring a gradient up at the bottom. There's a lot of just sort of empty space down here, and I want to sort of draw the eye away from that. So I want to bring the exposure down, And that's again just going to help the eye be drawn much more to the middle of the scene and to the church, which obviously is the main point in this image. I'm going to do the same again, create a new layer with the grad and bring one down from the top. Bring that exposure down. As I said before, there's not a lot I can do to rescue this sky, so I'm not even going to try at this point. Instead, I feel that this image is really going to benefit from a quite narrow panoramic crop, because all the actual important part of the scene is very much in this middle strip. There's dead sky at the top and there's wasted space at the bottom, which we don't need. So what I want to do is, using the crop tool, go Pano 2:1, and then I can bring in, as you can see, it pops into the aspect ratio. So now we've got this very narrow scene, and I don't want to clip off the tops of these mountains here. I don't mind about this over this side because we've still got all these this tree line that's still in. But I think that works really, really nicely. As you see, we've lost a lot of this just dead space in this field below. So if I click off that, that's our new shot. To me, this works so much better as a wide panorama like that. This is already something that I can imagine having framed in a nice wide frame, or printed on a nice wide canvas. It's got a lovely view to it. But the last thing that I feel I want to do is just try and make the church itself pop out a little bit more, because obviously it's being backlight, the sun is over here, so the side of the church we're actually seeing is in shadow. Now I can help that a little bit. I'm going to create another new layer, and this time I'm going to use the radial gradient mask, and I'm going to pull that circle sort of roughly over the top of where that church is. I want to bring the feather in again because I want it to look very nice and natural and blended in with the background. If we hit M, eventually we'll see where that mask is being applied. And right now, as you see, everything is red except the church. So what we need to do is right click on the layer, go invert mask, and now the mask is only going to be applied to the church itself, just like that. So we can hit M to disable seeing the mask. And I'm just going to bring that exposure up just a little bit. And in high dynamic range, I'm going to bring that shadow up just a touch. Now, if we turn that off and on, we'll see that there is sort of a noticeable halo going on around the church. There was one already. If you look closely, you can see there is already sort of this haziness around the church, but I am emphasizing that a little bit too much with this mask. So actually I'm going to bring the opacity down. I think I've gone a little bit overboard. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to rasterize the mask. And now I'm going to be able to erase it by literally just painting over the top of where that mask is. Let's press M so we can see it. And I can start to paint away where I don't want that mask to be. Now if we right click, we can see that I've got the hardness at 0. That's making sure that it's really feathered. But I've also reduced the opacity and the flow. That means that every time I paint, it's not completely erasing there's still some of the mask there, but every time I paint over and over, it reduces more and more. Now this allows me to really carefully brush away where I don't want that mask to actually be, which means that you can get a more natural blend with the background. Now it's already looking much more like it's focused on the church, but I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. So we can see that there is still very much like a general red haze, which is where the mask is. So we're going to carry on brushing away, reduce the size down to that. I can start brushing away some of these areas because we just do not want too much of the background being lightened. And I'm doing this very, very quickly. Of course, you would spend a lot more time in making sure this is done a lot neater. If I really want to take the time over it, I may even load it into Photoshop, use the pen tool to draw around the church, and then I can make sure that I'm applying any of these adjustments only to the church and there's no spill whatsoever. But this should do for now. So if I turn this layer on and off, yeah, I think that's a lot better. If we have a look, yes, this looks like a halo. It's actually just where the light is falling on the field behind it. So when we take that on and off, you'll see that actually this mask isn't doing that. That halo is already sort of there. Okay, let's zoom back out, because I think that is done. I'm really happy with this image. It's this golden sunset, and it was a really nice image before, just to begin with, if we have a look at before the changes. Yeah, it was dead nice, but I think that the edits that I've done really bring out that golden sunset. We've got this lovely warmth to this image. And yeah, I think I'm very pleased, particularly with the panoramic crop. It just gets rid of all that dead space and just makes this a much better image overall. So I hope that's been a helpful insight into how I would do this sort of editing using Capture One. It's not too dissimilar to Lightroom, but there are a lot of benefits to Capture One, particularly when you're using layers. But a lot of the tips and techniques that I've been using here, you can use in Lightroom as well if you are an Adobe fan. But if you have enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button, subscribe if you don't already, and hell, why not tell a few friends about this channel while you're at it. And I will see you next time.